Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome to this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Our guest today is Arash Azizi, an old friend of the show. Arash is a historian, writer, and expert on Iranian and Middle Eastern affairs. He's the author of The Shadow Commander and What Iranians Want, and his analysis appears in major international outlets. My interview with Arash comes as Iran continues its current negotiations with the United States over Iran's nuclear program. It's said against the backdrop of years of mistrust and regional tension. Iran insists on its right to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes, while the U.S. demands stricter limits and has imposed new sanctions. The latest rounds of talks have been postponed, with Oman mediating efforts to get both sides back to the table. Before we dive into our interview with Arash, let's take a look at the news of today. Australia's Labour Party wins re-election. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and his centre-left Labour Party have secured a decisive victory in Australia's national elections, marking the first time in over 2 decades that a sitting Australian leader has won back-to-back terms. A U.S. airstrike has hit a Houthi-run compound in Yemen, reportedly used as a migrant detention center, killing at least 38 people and injuring dozens more. The incident has drawn international scrutiny and criticism over civilian casualties. With that, let's jump into our interview with Arash. Arash, thanks for joining us.
Great to see you. How you doing?
I'm doing well. I know it's been about a year since we've had you on. The last time you were here, the president of Iran had died. Since then, Donald Trump was elected to a second term, and now the U.S. and Iran are entering talks about the nuclear program. Of course, this already happened 10 years ago. The U.S. signed a deal with Iran preventing it from getting a nuclear weapon. Where are we now? At a sort of broad overview.
Well, the Trump administration basically started new nuclear talks with Iran, something that I had predicted. I mean that, it's not surprising to me at all. It was surprising to some of his followers, apparently, because they don't think things through. Because President Trump has been actually very consistent on this issue. He said for a very long time, since the beginning of his political career, effectively, like his 2016 campaign, he's basically said quite clearly, and he said this during his first term, and he said it when he wasn't president. He said it when he came back as president. And the deal, he says that if Iran can show that it doesn't have nuclear weapons, and there are details there taking care of a few of the concerns that America has, and the concerns don't change between Democrat or Republican or Trump or Obama. They're all the same things, right? So effectively there are three things: Iran's nuclear weapons program, is its missiles program, and is its support for what are called in Washington, so to speak, the proxy groups. These militias around the region. Iran calls them axis of resistance. But the main thing is nuclear. So Trump has long said, "Look, I don't want to change the government in Iran. I don't want to overthrow them. What I really want is a deal. And if we can have a deal with this," he goes out of his way. His approach is always high risk, high reward. He says, if you don't get an agreement, I'll bomb the hell out of you. Effectively, he's saying that. But if we do get to an agreement, I want you to be very successful. I want, you to be a very rich, prosperous country. So it's very different from, in this way, it's very different from the Obama approach, if you will, which was, it was lower risk and lower reward. Like the idea was, well, I'm not likely to, even though Obama did say all options on the table, but, everyone knew that he would be unlikely to attack, especially after he didn't in Syria. And the other side as well, the idea was that, we'll have an agreement, the sanctions will be lifted, but, the sanctions on other countries, but there was no rush for American-Iranian business or anything like that. Anyways, so that's the sort of approach that Trump took to the talks. The talks have been ongoing for a few weeks now. The last round of them had to be postponed. Obviously, that sort of has both sides worried. Also, meanwhile, as the postponement happened, the Houthis, this is this Yemeni group that is supported by Iran, hit the Ben Gurion airport in Israel. After that, Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, is spoken very threateningly of hitting Iran directly. Effectively is threatened to hit Iran directly, as he did, of course, last year. Iran and Israel exchanged fire last year in 2024. So it's kind of a tense moment, but the talks are ongoing, and they're also quite obviously a subject to dissent and disagreement inside the Trump camp. To sum it up, there are those who are dead set against any possibility of war with Iran and want a deal. This is people like his son Don Jr., Tucker Carlson. I would say Witkoff, the envoy and the man in charge of the talks with Iran, generally belongs to that camp. This also probably includes maybe even Michael Anton, who is one of the other guys who is in charge of the technical team on the U.S. side. Although I don't know about Anton, there are also evidence that he would be sort of an Iran hawk, but many people think. I mean, I personally think he kind of fits here more. And on the opposite side are those who either want to see attacks on Iran, they really believe military attacks are inevitable and necessary at the moment, or they say if you want to have a deal, you should have such a maximalist deal that gets things like stopping a full stopping of any enrichment of uranium on Iranian territory. This is something Iran considers a red line, and they say that either because they want it or because they think if we have this maximalist demand, the Iranians will have to say no, so then we'll attack them. So there, folks like Mike Waltz, national security advisor, who lost his job, proponents of Israeli government in the U.S. And think tanks like the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, FDD, and many Iranians, actually, some Iranian opponents of the regime, I would say the right-wing opposition to the regime amongst the Iranian opposition, they are the ones who belong to the second camp, in the Trump camp. So inside the Trump camp, there are significant disagreements over these talks, for and against them, basically, and they have crystallized into a campaign around the person of Witkoff, who the latter camp is trying to attack, and the former camp is trying to defend. So folks like Don Jr., for example, have really come openly supporting Witkoff against those others.
Who are the leading voices on the Iranian side?
So in the Iranian side, it's very interesting. It used to be that the Iranian attempt to reach a deal with America used to be a big topic of dissent inside the Iranian regime in the 2013 to 15 period. This time around, there is much more of a establishment unity. I think in Iran, they understand that alternatives to the talks is a tax, and they want to avoid that at all costs. There are those who are opposing the talks, but they're much weaker. So I would say, of course, Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister, is leading the talks on the Iranian side. He used to be the number two to Foreign Minister Javad Zarif back in the 2013-15 talks. So he's a veteran guy. He's a very veteran diplomat. He has a lot of experience. For years, he was deputy foreign minister. He was ambassador to Finland and Japan. He holds a PhD in political science from Kent University in the UK. Now he's the foreign minister, and he's leading the talks. And he belongs to the reformist government of Masoud Pezeshkian, which was elected last year. But significantly, the core establishment sections, like the militia IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, is militia. That's a very powerful militia that controls most of the Iranian economy, much of the Iranian military. They're not against the talks anymore. But it's notable, for example, after the Houthis attacked Tel Aviv, this reformist newspaper in Iran called Ham-Mihan headlined, used the headline like shooting at the talks, meaning that basically he was criticizing the Houthis for disrupting Iran-US talks, and now they are being prosecuted. So there is still, of course, potential for disagreement. There is also a kind of an interesting strategic debate and disagreement in Iran, which goes something like this, which says that for years now, Iran has been so afraid of what is called like the trap of war, as in, one has to say, of course, Iran put itself on the war path by its support of the terrorist groups in the region, by its constant campaign against US and Israel. But it played this hide and seek game. And in the last few years, so Khamenei's doctrine, if you will, himself, he summed it up as and Khamenei, that's the supreme leader of Iran, right? His doctrine was what he himself said, no war, no negotiations. As in, we won't war, but we won't have to fight either. So we'll play this mouse and cat game. Well, guess what? Israel has called it his bluff in the last few years. He's went on the Axis militias, have really destroyed them, repeatedly operated on Iranian territory. Israel has done a lot of such operations. Of course, U.S. killed Iran's top general, Qasem Soleimani, in 2020. Mm-hmm. So, anyways.
Real quick, Arash, he says no war, no negotiations, yet just today or yesterday, Iran did say that if Israel or the U.S. were to attack, they would attack back. It seems like they're saber rattling.
Sure, but the no-war, no-negotiation position of the previous years was this idea. It was more like a prediction. So Iran, like every country in the world, will say, if you attack us, we're gonna attack back, right? I mean, no one will say no, thank you. If you attack us, we will just look, right?
Yeah.
But what Khamenei claimed was that based on my strategy, we would not enter a war with the U.S. because they wouldn't dare to attack us. It was his version of, sort of pathetic version of peace through strength. But of course, it wasn't real strength. And so that's why his bluff could be called. So now we have come to the situation. So I was telling you earlier, though, was that there is this strategic debate that said, because of the trap of the war, we've accepted all these blows from Israel and the US without really significantly attacking back. And basically they've called our bluff, so now they can do whatever they want against us. So there are those who think that, but there's broad establishment support for the talks. So in this sense, it's quite different from 2013, 2015, when the talks were subject to a much more intense debate inside the Iranian establishment. I could say in 2013, 2015, masses of the people supported the talks. They had elected President Rouhani. People voted, including me. We voted for him, because we thought he's going to carry out the talks. And then there were all these significant establishment sections that opposed him, right? This time around, it's quite different. This time around, there is people apathy. People don't really care, basically, to a good degree, because they've played this game so many times that they don't care as much. I mean, some of them do. Enough of them cared enough to show up to vote for Pezeshkian, but they're not sort of enthusiastic about it the way they were in 2013, 2015. But on the establishment, there's kind of a unity, because I think they understand that the alternative can be terrible and worse.
Who are the regional players outside of Iran in the current negotiations?
Well, there's also a big difference here. So in the 2013-2015 period, major regional countries such as Saudi Arabia and other, which is the leader of the Arab world, really. Saudi Arabia really leads the Sunni Arab world for sure. And that's really most of the Arab world. Now, it doesn't lead it without, so the United Arab Emirates has its own camp. Egypt has its own power, although I would say it's more allied with Saudis than Emiratis. But anyway, Saudis are an important power. Emiratis are an important power. Qatar is an important power in its own right. So a lot of these countries were uneasy about the 2013 to 2015 talks with Iran and the US, because they believed that Obama had ignored them and sort of went around them. And that actually is that's actually what pushed them to be closer to Israel, ultimately resulting in the Abraham Accords of 2020. This time around, they are really in favor of the talks. And this is because of a couple of things. First, it's because they've normalized relations with Iran, right? So Saudi Arabia had cut diplomatic ties with Iran back in 2016. It has normalized them now. Emiratis have normalized. All the countries except for Bahrain have normalized ties with Iran. Even Bahrain, the Bahraini Prime Minister has met his Iranian counterpart. They want to reestablish ties. There are some hurdles there because Bahrain now has very extensive relations with Israel. There's an Israeli military attaché in Bahrain, so I'm sure they have to work on it, but they definitely have, the intention. And so they have relations with Iran now, and they support the talks now because they want to focus on economic development. They don't want to, go to war after war, right? So they're very worried about a renewed of one more war in the region. So because of that, they support the talks. And then number two, of course, is that they're not on good terms with Israel at all, because Israel has really acted like a bully, has obviously committed all these massacres in Gaza, but it's also, Israel is not being very helpful to anybody. It's bombing Syria. It's sort of bombed Lebanon very extensively. It really showed no goodwill to the new Syrian administration, even though the new Syrian administration was like, look, we're never going to attack Israel. We're not going to let anybody attack Israel. We just replaced Hezbollah. We're going to kick Iran out. In fact, the new President Ahmad Ashar said that he was open to establishing relations with Israel as well. And yet Israel has attacked them. Of course, Israeli attack also come in the context of some atrocities being committed against the Druze minority in Syria. That's an Arab minority that has a significant presence in Israel as well. Druze are an Arab minority in Israel. They serve in the Israeli army, unlike the other Arab citizens of Israel. So, unlike most other Arab citizens of Israel. So there is an added dimension there. But anyways, this all culminates in the fact that Saudis and others are not on very good terms with Israel right now. So they very much prefer the Iran-US talks to go ahead, and for more normalized relations in the region. Less sanctions, less possibility of war. It's ultimately good for them.
So why did President Trump pull out the first time if he's just going to renegotiate?
Well, he wanted the same thing the first time. It's interesting. The answer is this. President Trump had understood in the first term that he has this great cudgel against Obama. That, Israel was very unhappy with the Iran deal. Netanyahu was unhappy, I have to say. Not really Israel, because there were many in the Israeli security establishment who were not opposed to the 2015 deal. But Netanyahu wasn't just unhappy about it. He had used it as a cudgel to organize the Republican opposition, right? It's effectively a campaign against Obama on U.S. soil. He came at the invitation of the Republican-led House, spoke to the Congress. So Trump, who's a political genius, really understood that this is a great sort of cudgel to find. So if he leads the fight against the Iran deal, a lot of people will come behind him, right? But once he was in office, yes, he did withdraw ultimately in 2018. Although in 2018, right? So it took him a couple of years. But throughout, even after he withdrew, he kept saying he wants to negotiate with Iran without conditions. It's a very important part of history that we shouldn't forget, right? Trump didn't. So Trump is known as an Iran hawk because he brought maximum pressure. He put pressure on Iran, but pressure to what goal, right? Trump's game has always been very, very clear that yes, F you up if I need to. But his goal is clear. The goal, he always said, was getting a deal with Iran. So he's doing what he said he would do. It's just that people don't, either don't listen or they have their own sort of desires. It's kind of astonishing for me. I mean, I wrote and I predicted that he would talk, and it was always clear to me that that's what he would do because it's what he says he would do. And it also fits with his other. And I mean, this is true with a lot of other Trump things, good or bad, whether you like them or not. I just don't understand. People are like, oh, I can't believe he did that. I mean, he said he would do it, Yeah. Why shouldn't you? He doesn't look like a guy who says something that he doesn't actually do. Not to me anyways, right? Like any other president, he would have to find priorities. He would have to see what is practical, what is not. But it was always clear to me that he wants a deal. Now, there's a lot of devil in the details. We have to see what deal he can actually get. It might very well fall still. There are 10 bills in the Congress that are sort of anti-Iran bills, bills that are against ultimately the government of Iran. That's what I mean by anti-Iran. But, there's a maximum support bill, which is supposedly a regime change bill, basically. Right. There's a maximum pressure bill. There's a no energy to Iran bill, no Iranian energy bill, which will ban Iraqi import of Iranian energy. There is no Hezbollah in our hemisphere. Anyway, so there's 10 bills in total. And if these talks fall, we have to see if there will be congressional action on those, which will, make life even tougher for the Iranian regime.
So walk us through the specifics of what the U.S. wants out of a deal this time.
They want, look, okay, so first, they want to make sure Iran is not going to get a nuclear weapon. Now, the question is, how do you make sure of that, right? It will be a version of this, limiting the enrichment of uranium. Limiting means what? It means bringing it down. So right now, Iran enriches at 60%. You can bring it down to below 3.67%. That's what was allowed at the previous 2015 deal. Or if you can, stopping it fully. But Iran says it won't stop it fully. The other thing is shipping enriched uranium. So Iran has enriched uranium now, right? It's a bank of enriched uranium. Shipping this out to Russia. The idea is that, okay, if you want it for fuel, you ship it out there, you make it into fuel, you get the fuel. That then you cannot use that for nuclear weapons, right? And so other measures like that. And of course, intensified monitoring by the IAEA. That's the International Atomic Energy Agency. So the UN's atomic agency is based in Vienna. Its job is to make sure, make sure that nobody is going beyond what they're supposed to do. So that's primarily what the US want. Then there are other two fronts, as I said, missiles and the region. On missiles, US would want Iran to have less ballistic missiles, less ballistic long-range ballistic missiles, limit them, destroy some of them. Of course, hard red line for Iran also, because Iran's basic point is in the last 25 years, the country has been impoverished. We've really lost everything. One thing we have gained is that we've been able to develop this native arms industry, right? But strong enough that Iran now sells drones to Russia, right? So it has something to say for itself there. And he says, to lose the one thing we have is too much. So that's sort of Iran sees the red line. Question is whether the US will push on that or not. And the third one is the region. That's easier because Iran has already lost. Iran has already lost most of the axis. But for example, Houthis can be subject to a deal. Iran says it would not support the Houthis anymore. It would stop them. It would publicly declare that it's not supporting them. And there are formulas that can be found. So these are the three main areas of subject to discussion between Iran and the US, although nuclear is by far the most important one. I always think it's very interesting. You always have these debates about technical and political things. Once you have a political will, the technical details can sort themselves out. If you really want a deal, you're not gonna not have a deal because you disagreed about how much uranium has to ship to Russia or not. You usually end up not having a deal because you don't want a deal, if that makes sense, right? So if you want a deal, the details can be worked out.
What are the current biggest gaps, though, in the negotiations? What's holding things up?
Well, number one, I don't know, right? So because these are secret negotiations, so my guess is as good as other analysts, right?
Sure.
But they're very careful not to say it, right? So I've done this a long time. Right? Usually they're very careful when they talk. They keep a wink, they say something, and then different sources say different things. But I think it's a question of Iranian enrichment. Whether US probably his demand is stop it altogether. Iranians say, well, no, we want to stop it altogether, but we'll limit it the way you want, right? So they're sort of negotiating about that. B, shipment of uranium outside Iran. Iran again would probably not like to ship its enriched uranium outside, but is I think ultimately willing to. I think these are the two main sticking points on the nuclear issue. On the other issues, I don't know if any negotiations have been really happening around the regional stuff. It might be that Iran says, Houthis, we don't control them. We just have no control over any of these groups. These are all just good, devout Muslim men of the region. That's why they're doing this. Which is obviously not true. And then, US would maybe ask for some sort of a open lack of support for these groups in Iraq and Yemen and Hezbollah and all that. And, they'll do something like that. And on the missile issue, again, it's one of the toughest ones. But I don't think Iran wants to give anything. Iran doesn't want to, basically says, we're not going to talk about our missiles. We have missiles, we're keeping them. There's nothing to talk here. Whereas US would like to get some dismantling of them. So I think these are the main sticking issues.
Okay. What would you, and I know this would be a little bit of speculation, which you probably don't like, but what would you speculate would be the timeline for a deal?
I think, so President Trump, when he sent a letter to Ayatollah Khamenei earlier this year, he had said 2 months, right? The idea was that, okay, it's hard to get a deal that has all these details in 2 months, so maybe we can have an interim deal. We are a good month has passed since then, according to from when you count. We are already May 5th. So from the beginning of the it's 3 months to the Trump administration now, and he sent the letter pretty early on. So we're getting there. The problem with the interim deal. So last time around we also had an interim deal, right? So there was an interim deal in 2013, and then it was called the JPA, Joint Plan of Action. Then it led to the 2015 deal, or known as JCPOA, right? So 2013, the Geneva deal was made in Geneva, and made the framework, which then led to the talks, which then led to the permanent deal, which ended up not being that permanent, anyways. But of course, the opponents of talks really hate the idea of an interim deal because the way they see it, Iran gets an interim deal, it's sort of foot dragging. It avoids military attacks, right? And then it can do what it wants, and it's sort of seen as cunningly buying time. So there is that issue. But realistically, I think they're going to need to come up with something in the next few weeks next couple of months at most. President Trump is not known for his patience. He would hate the idea, and he's basically said so openly. He would hate the idea of being dragged. His line is basically, Biden was stupid. They could drag him. They're not going to be able to drag me. I mean, that's what President Trump says. Now, of course, Iran also has learned this language. So now they love to, Arash keeps referring to the failed Biden team. He basically keeps saying, Biden sucked, but President Trump, Arash wrote an op-ed in Washington Post. He said President Trump can be a president of peace. Right? So they're really trying to appeal to his business side. And anyways, so I think it's possible to have some sort of a deal in the next few weeks, few months, or there might be the case that there is a deal, an interim deal, but maybe a significant interim deal in which Iran does give some real concessions and then negotiations for a long time. The important thing is to give President Trump something he can show to people. Right? He can be like, I got this. You said nobody else could, but I was able to do it. Right? Like that's what he wants, and it's not that hard for Iran to give it to him because Iran does so many bad things that if it stops just some of them, scales back some of them, they can give real concessions if they're smart enough. That's what they'll do.
Obviously, the Ayatollah is an elderly man. President Trump is not young. He's 78 or 79. Do you think that the eventual passing of the Ayatollah could lead to a more hardline regime, or what would the future of Iran do, and how would this impact sort of the stickiness of a deal?
I think in most ways it's the opposite. Khamenei is 86 years old. He is the last real revolutionary ideologue in the top of the Iranian regime. Everybody else are a bunch of sort of, often corrupt business and military people. These are not people who have die-hard Islamist hardline convictions like Khamenei and that are, ready to sort of sacrifice things for them. So, which is sort of a good prospect for pragmatism and for dealing with the West. So I think Khamenei's death will not lead to while it's not entirely impossible that you would have a more hardline. So there are hardline figures, right? People like Mir Bagheri, people like Arafi. If they come, Iran would be a rejuvenated hardline situation. But I find that very, very unlikely. I mean, I give it like a 5% chance, right? I think a much more likely chance is a more, let me just say this, a much more likely chance is a more centrist, more West-facing sort of leadership. But there is a chance that just because the leadership would be more fresh, they might get to be more confrontational in some contradictory way. Right? So even though they might be more West-facing and stuff, they will be, Khamenei was a very wise guy, sort of, in power for a very long time. And he was basically a coward. I mean, a very important part of him is that he's a coward. He's not one who wants to get into confrontation. Maybe the next guy wouldn't have that personal quality, and that's dangerous.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Do you think that a deal would pass Congress?
He doesn't need to pass Congress.
That's a good point. Thank you.
I don't think that. Well, this is always a point of contention, right? So I told you about like 10 bills that are in the line. Right. But also, the Congress will do what Trump says. I can't see a situation in which Trump strongly supports something and the Congress dares say no to him. I mean, this is also his magic, right? It's also true with Netanyahu, by the way. What are they going to do? Stand up and say no to Trump? It's much harder to see, which is why those who sort of were smart enough understood a deal with Trump had a better chance in many ways than a deal with the Harris administration. Even though I don't think they wanted Trump to win, I think they were scared of that eventuality because I think they really would have played along, sort of drag Harris a bit had she been president. They would have tried anyways, and we don't know whether they would have succeeded. But that is the thing about Trump. It's much harder for opponents of the deal to disrupt Trump-led talks than it is to disrupt Obama or Biden or Harris-led talks.
Do you really think that a deal would lead to increased cooperation between Iran and the U.S. and that Iran would rein in its sort of activities through like the IRG in places like Syria, Iraq? They run Iraq still. Do you think that would sort of put them in line to act more like Jordan, for example? Or do you think that they will continue
they won't act like
out?
Jordan. Look, they won't act like Jordan. Jordan is a small, poor state, largely reliant on U.S. aid. So no, Iran is never going to be. Why would it be Jordan, right?
Well, will they stop sort of their extracurricular activities around the Middle East? I mean, you document
They would regulate them. So I think yes. The answer is I think what they ultimately want. But who I mean by they, I don't mean Khamenei, right? And Khamenei really has a dream of an anti-American sort of empire revolution and stuff. Luckily for all sides involved, he's gonna kick the bucket at some point, right? He's 86, so this dream has failed. It's failed. He's made a fool out of himself. Nobody in Iran believes in it. Nobody in the region believes in it. He's a failure. But I think the Iranian leadership, I think what they ultimately want, not unlike Saudis, not unlike Turkey, not unlike Emiratis, is to say, look, this is Iran. We're a great power in this region. Respect us, give us something of the cut, right? Just respect us as a regional player and we'll play along with you. I think that's ultimately what they want. And I think they will deal with other countries in the region. They've given up. Look, if you wanted to be a true Islamist 1979 revolutionary, you don't have to just destroy Israel. You have to fight and overthrow Saudi Arabia. You have to fight all these GCC countries. You have to fight Egypt. You have to fight Jordan. They've given up. They understand that this is sort of not how it works. So in a way, they're reverting to a more Iranian, traditional. Iran is a great power. I mean, not a great power on a global scale, obviously, right? But it's also not Jordan, right? It's a regional behemoth under any country, right? It's one of the countries. It's the only country in the region that is a founding member of the League of Nations and the United Nations. It's a country, obviously, heir to an ancient civilization. It's one of the most populous countries in the region, one of the most educated countries in the region, one of the biggest economies in the region, despite all its problems. So it can't be compared with somewhere like Jordan, right? So it sort of wants its place. But do I think it's possible that if Iran and the US normalize more, Iran would basically be a more responsible regional player? Yes, I ultimately think that's possible because it's in their interest. Why not? Why not? These people, IRGC folks, what do they want? They don't want Islamist revolution. They don't want to liberate Palestine. Where are their sons and daughters studying? Canada and Switzerland, right? They're not even in Russia or China, let alone they're not dying in Gaza, right? Ultimately, they want to be a corrupt elite that is owed some respect and are happy to work with the US. And they've worked with the US so much. It's not like they haven't done, they've worked with the US against Taliban. They've worked with the US against Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They've worked with the US against ISIS, right? They have a long history of working with the US. Of course, they worked with the US in the 1980s, hello, Iran-Contra, right?
Yeah.
So, it's not these guys it's very interesting. It's like, yes, they're very anti-American. They've done all these things, but it's not like they don't have a history of collaborating with the US either.
Right. My final question for you, because I want to be respectful of your time. You wrote a great book, The Shadow Commander, about General Soleimani. If he were alive today, what influence would he have on the negotiations? Would he be more hardlined? Would he push them to make a deal? What would he do?
That's a great question. Of course, I'm sure negotiators will always use this. I think, the truth is Soleimani was killed in January 2020. That's 5 years ago. And the empire he had built really has collapsed in the last 5 years. Would it have collapsed in the same way? Was he alive? I can't really say no to that question, to be honest. Because ultimately there are very strong structural forces that no one man could have stopped. Would there have been October 7 attacks? Was he alive? Was that actually, it's an interesting question. Was there a vacuum of leadership in the Axis that led to the October 7 attacks, which are disastrous? Anybody from a strategic point of view could have said that you just opened the Pandora's box, that it's disastrous. Could we argue that perhaps lack of Soleimani and lack of a sort of a strategic leadership in the Axis is what allowed for those terrible attacks to go on in the first place? Counterfactual history, especially that of what if this guy had survived, is always hard to do. But I would say yes. I would say that ultimately, we don't need to. Soleimani is dead, but we can look at other of his IRGC comrades, people like Baghar Ghalibaf, who's the Speaker of the Parliament. I think ultimately, yes. I think these guys. So Soleimani was a true devotee of Khamenei. He was a true Islamist. He truly wanted to sort of expand his ideas and stuff. But he also had a sort of military Iranian side. No, it's a strange thing. I'm sure you have other sort of military guests. I've come to believe, writing about the military for so long, that folks who wear the khakis and are in the battlefronts almost form a mentality of their own. And I think a lot of times you hear them talking about each other, like Americans, and Iranians, and Israelis, right? Like they all understand each other better than almost the civilians on their own sides. You know what I mean? You sometimes felt like General Petros understood Qasem Soleimani better than he understood some of his own folks in DC, right? So I think because of that, I could see him basically agreeing to the talks and wanting to this sort of round of possible confrontation and war to end. But
Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, would Assad still be in power if he were alive? He obviously
That's-
saved him. You wrote that very well in your book, talked about his showing up basically to Moscow, talking Putin into intervening, and then showing up in Syria. But it's not related to the Iran talks, indirectly, sure.
No, it's interesting. It's an interesting question. I think if you look at 2019, 6 months before he died, there was mass movements against pro-Iran forces in Iraq and Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
So had Soleimani survived, he would have had a very tough time maintaining his empire.
Mm-hmm.
It's $1 million question.
I guess
his presence alone would have saved Assad or not? I ultimately want to say I don't think he could have. Because I think ultimately there's so much you can there was this hollowed out regime that had to collapse at some point. I mean, not had to collapse also. Al-Shar is the one who did it, right? He led this dramatic uprising and was able to bring it down. But counterfactual history is fun because we know that it's always will be pure speculation after all.
Yeah, I'd be remiss not to ask this one final question, I swear, but you paint a great picture of his daughter at his funeral giving a rebel-rousing speech. Where is she now? How is she involved with current Iranian politics?
It's a very interesting question, actually, because it's because Zainab, the daughter that I write about,
Mm-hmm.
She gives the rabble-rousing speech. She really wants to carry the torch, but she's basically too much of an extremist. I mean, like she gives the speeches, it puts people off, right? But Soleimani himself was actually very careful not to do that as much. But his other daughter, funnily enough, Narges, which I'm not sure I even mentioned her in the book because who knew who's going to be political. Narges is elected Tehran city councillor, and lo and behold, she's not the most hardliner in many ways, right? So it's interesting. I would say broadly speaking, the legatees to the Soleimani legacy in Iran, like those who claim the Soleimani's mantle, are not the hardliners. Are sort of the IRGC leadership, which have kind of made a pact with centrists in Iran now. Ghalibaf, for example, supports the Speaker of Parliament. So in the same sort of general vein, Narges is very sort of anti-corruption Tehran city councillor. And yeah, she's definitely not sort of one of the hardliners.
Would you conclude it was a good move for President Trump to kill Soleimani then?
Well, well, no. I mean, it's an interesting question. Good. Let's keep it at the level of was it effective or not? I think ultimately it would be hard not to see that from Trump's point of view, it worked. It took out Iran's most valuable general. It did not cause a broad war, as many of us had feared. And hey, it did not stop Iran from coming back and negotiating with him. In fact, calling him a president of peace in 4 years. Who would have thought? The guy who killed Qasem Soleimani, right? Khamenei had said, you are the one who killed Soleimani, we'll never talk to you. And of course, they ended up talking to him. So I would say if we see this as sort of a bluff by Trump or something sort of an act of a bit of a gamble, it kind of worked.
Okay. Arash, where can our listeners follow your work?
Well, I write for The Atlantic. That's one of the main places. I have a little Substack, so if they, I post my stuff there. I write for the regional place like the National UAE and Majalla, and Liberties. It's another journal in Washington DC that I write more long-term pieces for. But these are some places, and I'm working on a new book, tentatively titled Counterweights: Iran, Israel, and the Struggle for the Middle East, which I've just gotten the contract for a couple of weeks ago. So it's going to be a few years before it hits the stands, but it will be there one day.
Wonderful. Arash Azizi, thank you so much for the time. It's good to see you again. Thanks again for tuning in to this episode of Clearer Than Truth.